This is going to be short and sweet. Basically, all this is just a review of a moderate change to the rules. As John mentioned earlier, there's a difference between rules and regulations and laws, and this is a adjustment to a rule as part of a law. So the changes are mainly to remain current with the changes that were made last year by Health and Human Services as part of the mandatory guidelines for HHS. Whenever they change what you need to be drug testing for, all federal agencies that drug test need to make that change as well. So this is the DOT making that change. It's also an effort to combat the opioid epidemic, which is a serious problem across the country. I'm sure that many of you guys have had drivers that are affected or have known people that have had drivers that are affected. It's a very serious issue. And this is one way that the federal government is hoping to combat it. As Elaine Chao, the Secretary for the Department of Transportation, said, the ability to test for a broader range of opioids will advance transportation safety significantly, provide another deterrence to opioid abuse, which will better protect the public and ultimately save lives. So it's fairly important, this adjustment that they're making. Specifically, as of the first of this year, safety-sensitive people in transportation are now being tested for 4 additional opiates: hydrocodone, hydromorphone, oxymorphone, and oxycodone. Typically, these are Oxycontin, Percodone, Percocet, Vicodin, Lortab, what is this one? Norco, Dilantin, and Exalgo. So pretty common semi-synthetic opiates that they're including in the drug and alcohol testing panel. Some of you guys may have already looked at results and noticed that there's more drugs listed under opiates or opioids. This would be those. When you bring this up to drivers and they mention that they have a prescription for this, the DOT in this rule-making adjustment made it very clear that people with a legitimate medical use, and more specifically, people and drivers who have a prescription consistent with the Controlled Substances Abuse Act, or Controlled Substances Act, are okay. And if you look at the Federal Register, which is 82 FR 52229, it'll go through the DOT will go through the explanation as well as the comments to it, basically outlining the fact that there will not be any additional penalties for people with legitimate prescriptions. And that the only changes that are happening is that now this is another tool that MROs will be using to evaluate if people can operate these vehicles safely. But what they made very clear is the MRO is not permitted to question whether the prescribing physician should have prescribed the substance. There's some legalese stuff that's mentioned in the Federal Register about expanding the time limit that a MRO can have to communicate with a prescribing physician, but that's not really something you guys need to worry about. Having the prescribed amount show positive in the test still may not result in a positive test. MROs still have the ability to, after contacting the driver, getting a list of prescriptions, contacting the prescribing physician, can still modify a positive lab result to a negative test result. It's super important that you guys have conversations with your drivers, if they are using opioids, that they're following the prescription very diligently. There is an assumption that costs will go up, but it's extremely marginal. On average, they're assuming that DOT-regulated tests will only go up by 30 cents per test, which basically turns into about just under $2 million. So that's not a major change. MRO costs are also assuming to go up slightly because they are assuming that with these changes, it will increase the positive rate by 1%. So you'll be looking at just shy of about $4 million increase in MRO costs. So it's pretty marginal to see about this change only increasing costs nationally about $6 million. With this change, they've also changed some of the concentration levels. You'll notice also under amphetamines, they're no longer testing MDEA as an analyte. They're staying with MDA, but they've removed MDEA as an analyte just because the testing rate for it is so low. But they've also added the confirmatory and initial concentration cutoffs as well for hydrocodone, hydromorphone, and oxycodone, oxymorphone. The biggest impact that they're anticipating is that the number of positive results is going to go up. Currently sitting about just shy of 1%. The FMCSA and the Department of Transportation is anticipating it to go up 1%, which means that there will be more testing on the horizon. Currently, as you guys saw, the FMCSA testing rate is at 25%. PHMSA just went up to 50%. I anticipate FMCSA will also go up to 50% in 2019. Because by rule, if there's 1 year where it's above 1%, rates have to go up. So this year anticipate more positive test results, and next year anticipate more randoms. As a company, there are some minor things that you probably need to do. In the Federal Register and in the rule change, it does not say that there's anything specific that as an employer you need to do. But if you have a drug and alcohol policy that mentions the actual drugs or mentions these words, you probably need to update them. That includes changing the word opiates to opioids because it will include 5 and not 3. Also removing MDEA if you have that mentioned for your amphetamines. As well, if you mention cutoff levels in your drug and alcohol policy, that also needs to be updated. But this can also all be changed if you just simplify your drug and alcohol policy and just say that it will be in compliance with 49 CFR Part 40. That way you can just cover yourself, maybe include like the latest version of it in your drug and alcohol policy, but you won't have to make constant updates when those things change. And there are already changes this year, and I anticipate there will be definitely changes next year. And there's a suggestion that if you are making these changes, that you do send a letter to your employees and let them know. You don't necessarily have to do that, but it is a best practice. Another thing that you should really be discussing with your drivers is making sure that you have conversations with them about if they are using opioids as a prescription. It is not your guys' right to act as doctors and tell an employee that they shouldn't be taking one thing over another. But it is your right to get a list of said prescriptions that they're on, and then maybe have discussions with them about talking to their physician and seeing if those drugs that they're taking makes it okay for them to function in these safety-sensitive positions. Because there is a concern in using these and operating motor vehicles. So it's within your rights to get a list of prescriptions that a driver's on. If you notice something, have a conversation with them about them maybe discussing with their prescribing physician about changes to what they're taking. Make sure also to just talk to your employees about the opioid epidemic. I mean, the current administration has declared it an emergency, which has made some funds available. And I know that there are certain states that have declared it an emergency, which gives certain, that allows state funds and also some Medicaid funds to be spent in certain ways to help address that. And if you have drivers that are suffering from opioid dependency or have a problem with addiction, those resources may be available. So just communicate with them and make sure that they're aware that there's a support system for them, and that if they need help, that they should be able to get help. And you guys as employers can be part of the process to help improve things. As well, you may want to start having conversations with your supervisors and making sure that they are aware of what's in the drug and alcohol policy, make sure that they're enforcing the drug and alcohol policy. And then if they're aware of some of the ins and outs of Part 382 and Part 40 in regards to reasonable suspicion, what counts as reasonable suspicion, what doesn't count as reasonable suspicion, what sort of training they need to have to be able to identify if a driver appears to be under the influence of drugs or alcohol, and then how they can eliminate options to be able to ask for a reasonable suspicion test. And then to make perfectly clear that the drug and alcohol policy is something that needs to be enforced rigorously in order to stay compliant with the Department of Transportation. Just to mention, I did this presentation last year. I'm not going to do the whole presentation again, but in rules that are coming down the pipeline, still have the Drug and Alcohol Testing Clearinghouse. It's supposed to come out in 2020. If you guys were not here last year to see the presentation, it's available online on our website. Not that specific one, but the one in general. And this is gonna be serious. Still supposed to be coming. There has not been anything that I've read from the Department of Transportation about any delays, but it's supposed to go into effect in January 2020. There also hasn't been any word about if there has been any bids for any companies to set up the website, but just be aware that right now you need to start looking at changing some of your language in your driver qualification process, and be prepared to sign up with the clearinghouse when it goes live, probably sometime in late 2019. It's the federal government, so things oftentimes get delayed. Maybe this will get delayed two or 4 years, but it is coming. The comments are already in, the rules already made, implementation and the building of the site is what's coming next. So that's all that I have. Like I said, it'd be short and sweet. So if you have any questions, yes, Dave.
How long does an opioid stay in your system once you take it?
It depends on the amount that you take, how often that you take it, and kind of when you take it. Generally, the window is like 1 day to like 2 weeks. So for people that are using this for habitual pain, they're much more likely to test positive than someone that uses it off and on over a long period of time. Something that was explicitly mentioned in the rulemaking is that a legitimate prescription will not depend on the timing that it was prescribed. So if you have a driver that is taking one of these drugs for pain and the prescription's like a year old, that won't automatically be a positive test result. If they're just using it very, very, very rarely for pain, then it's still okay. The DOT determined that they're not able to they don't have the ability to make that sort of judgment. Only the DEA can do that, and they haven't. So that was a long tangential thing to answer Dave's question, but usually it's like 1 day to like 2 weeks. Again, it depends on the amount that the person takes, how often they take it, just sort of like every other drug. Yes, Joe?
So the marijuana edibles and all that, you know, we're kind of used to marijuana. It used to be about 30 days to get out of your system, kind of fat soluble and all that kind of stuff. Is that kind of the same thing with the edibles? Is it kind of the same answer? It kind of depends on how much obviously how much you use, or is anything different with edibles?
Yes and no. Because this is more of an answer coming from experience of dealing with people that use a lot of edibles, and also some knowledge of just like research. But usually the THC concentration in edibles is much higher than it is in the other ways to consume it. So it can stay in your system longer. Again, it really depends on how often you use it. Habitual users are going to test positive more often than non-habitual users. But the way the amount of THC that's available is so much higher in a lot of those products that it only makes a positive test more likely. Any other questions? Cool, well, that's all I've got.